on, folks? It's Mike here, and welcome back to my SDL series. I hope you enjoyed that little introduction. We're going to have a little bit of fun today because we're going to be talking about how to use a game controller with the SDL library. Now, this is just actually a lot of fun here, and there's something really cool, to be honest, about getting one of these controllers to work here. So I've got the little window here, and I'll show you that as I move the joypad here, and I'll show you how to detect the button presses as well. We can move around this little rectangle. So that's kind of the goal for today's lesson. We're going to look at some code here. And I can't emphasize how much fun it is just to even have something this simple here and be moving around the joystick, and it's just really satisfying. So in some ways, maybe this will make your game playing fun, and regardless, it's just a nice little skill to have. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive into it and learn how to use these controllers with the SDL library. Now, I will be showing some code from SDL2, and I'll show the migration from SDL3 because I expect that to be coming anytime. And with that said, there's also an exciting announcement towards the end of this video, so stay tuned for that. So let's just go ahead and Google SDL API, look at the API by category here. And we can actually switch this up again as I want to be ready for the SDL3 migration here. So in case this defaults to SDL3, again, just look at the URL page here and you might see some different things. So regardless, you'll see the joystick support for SDL3, same as it is for SDL2. You just scroll down, find your input events, and there you go. Now, my understanding of SDL and how things are implemented is the joystick support is sort of a lower level framework here. You'll also notice there is game controller support. Looking at SDL 3, for instance, there is also the gamepad support as well. So there might be some differences, for instance, with these, but regardless, this will work here because joystick might be literally like for a flight simulator or a racing game or something, that type of joystick, or even like the steering wheels. But the joystick API will work with these controllers. So this is what I've got to play around with, and you'll be able to play around with and do the same thing with the gamepad API once you understand how it works. So anyways, let's focus on the SDL2 stuff. I'm going to jump into joystick support. And the basic idea is we basically just want to be able to have a joystick plugged in. And the SDL API will actually take care of some other things too, like if we plug in a joystick while we're playing. So again, it can handle some of those nitty-gritty details for us. And each of our joysticks or gamepads, if you're using the gamepad API, will have some ID associated with it. So again, if you're going to have multiple of these plugged in, if you're playing with a friend or whatever, that is something that you can support as well. And depending on how in-depth you're going to get with this, the important thing to know is, this particular controller I have is a Xbox controller, but it's, a special one with different, buttons that I picked up. And there are these joystick GUIDs or global unique identifiers, which are supposed to, again, as it says here, not change over time. So for example, you can identify different devices. So if you wanted to do some sort of like detection in your game to say like, hey, this is an Xbox controller, or this is a retro like Nintendo controller or whatever, you might be able to use those GUID IDs to, select the actual configuration and do, some fun stuff with that. So all in all, it's kind of nice to know what some of those features are because, those IDs might even be useful for detecting, is this a joystick or is this a gamepad, and, figure out which API to use. So anyways, with that said, let's just go ahead and play around with this. I'm actually just going to show you some code and then we'll hop into the API because I want to show you how to get started here. So let's go ahead and clear the screen here, and I'm going to draw your attention here. If you've been following along with the series, then you're hopefully pretty familiar with how to compile and build things. Let's see. So the changes here from my normal examples here, let's go to step, I'll call this 0. So after we initialize the window, we are going to want to initialize the joystick support. So then we have those APIs, and then we listen for certain types of events, for instance, like if a joystick is connected and so on. So we are going to want to make sure that we do that first and foremost. And you could do some air, or you could initialize these systems, one at a time if you wanted. Again, I just put them all here. But that's the very first thing to make sure that you do. If you don't do this step, you're unlikely to have any success with the rest of this tutorial. So anyways, let's go ahead and scroll down here. For the purpose of this demo, just to do something interesting, again, I've created a window, and I've set that up here, a 640 by 480 window, and then I've set up a hardware accelerated window. It doesn't really matter that much, but we are going to want to draw a rectangle here. And I'll jump to the joystick stuff in a moment here, but again, we're going to have a basic game loop that loops through our code. And if I scroll down here, we're going to see we have a bunch of events here that we're going to try to tackle or detect for our joystick. So I'll hop back to that in a moment. And then the basics of our demo is just clearing our window like we've done in previous tutorials, drawing some color here for our rectangle, and then presenting that, okay? Because we want to be able to see this rectangle move along with our joystick. All right, so, and then of course, destroying the window. So those are the prereqs. So if you haven't watched the first few videos in this series, make sure you review those. Now let's talk a little bit more about the joystick. So as I mentioned, we need to initialize the subsystem for handling joystick events. So we know, or SDL rather knows what to look for here. Let's go ahead and scroll down here and pause for a moment. And then we need to create our joystick. So there is a SDL joystick object here. So we'll go ahead and create that here for this type here. And then basically what I'm going to do here is just detect that we have at least one joystick plugged in. If we don't, we'll emit some sort of error message. Maybe something went wrong, or again, this is the type of stuff that you might want to handle in user code that prompts the user to plug in a joystick. So I'm just going to simply detect if a joystick is plugged in or not. Again, this was given to us by SDL, just querying this global state. We can see how many joysticks are plugged in case you've got more than one, and then we'll associate this joystick that we create with a ID or an instance for that joystick. Okay, so as they're plugged in or whatever. That's how the joystick is going to be identified. And you might want to, again, indicate to players if they're, user 1 or whatever. And this ID here, 0, is something that you can eventually query here as well. So once you've associated that ID or whatever that joystick is with the joystick object here, then you can, retrieve that ID or whatever. So if you're for whatever reason moving around and you unplug the joystick and then plug it back in, that will increment and decrement this number here. So again, occasionally you might want to query this, okay? Okay, now the next important thing for the joystick is to understand just a little bit about how these joysticks work. Or rather just pragmatically something that we have to do for setting up our joystick. And this is what's known as a dead zone. You've probably encountered this, maybe unfortunately in one of your older consoles or something. But what I'm going to do here is just draw, let's draw with our paintbrush here so you can actually see. I'm going to draw a little box here, and then I'm going to draw my joystick here, just as a circle here. So, and here, I'll try to make it look more like the little joystick here that we can, move in the different directions, all 360 directions here. But the basic idea with this guy here, this joystick here, is when we move it to the right, we're going to get some value here. This value happens to be between the value of 32,000 something, whatever the length of a short is, to negative 32,000 and whatever the length of a short is, I forget. But I'll go ahead and show that. And that's true in all directions here. Okay, so I think it looks something like this here. And that's going to tell us how much we have moved our little joystick here, whether it's on our gamepad or an actual joystick in some direction. And then, of course, if you move it somewhere in between here, you're going to get a value in between. Okay, and I should say that this is for the I'll put these in boxes here, the X direction, or excuse me, the Y axis. Let's label that Y axis, and these for the X axis. Okay, X axis. Okay, now why is this important? Why am I highlighting this? Well, what you might notice is there's a sensor somewhere in this controller here that's going to tell you, how much or what velocity you've moved to the left or to the right here, okay, of that actual little joystick thing. But what you might notice is there's actually going to be a little bit of signal or noise, right? It's not likely to settle right in the middle at 0, 0 for each of those values for the X and the Y axis. I mean, that's what we'd like. That's what a well-calibrated controller is going to do. And even though as we sort of move or flick the controller back, for instance, here, let's just move it up here, right? It's going to take some time to get back into the default position. So what you want to do is you create what's known as a dead zone, which I'm just going to highlight in here. And I'll draw an arrow here. This is the dead zone, some variable, where basically you give yourself a little bit of cushion and say if it's within some range, just ignore that value. That dead zone, for instance, might just be something like this. Let's just draw a smaller little axis here. I think I picked the value 8,000. I've tried like 5,000 works sometimes. But basically, if anything's in the dead zone here, in this red region, wherever I move my joystick, I want to just ignore those values, okay? So in my actual game code, you want to account for this type of thing. So that's why you're going to see this dead zone variable here at line 56 in our code. Okay, so let's go ahead and move back to our code here, where I just picked a value here that said, in order for us to account for there was a move on our actual joystick, make sure it's greater or less than that value, right? Greater than 8,000 or less than negative 8,000 to indicate, the different directions among each axes. I'm also going to record the axis for the X and the Y direction. So if I'm moving up or down, I'll show you in the SDL API how to do that. Okay, so that's just a little bit about what this code's doing and how we're detecting some movement here. Okay, let's see. So here's our main game loop here. Of course, we're going to have some event here. I added a little bit of a delay here. You can do frame, rate, code or frame independent movement or these types of things here. But I just wanted to add a little bit of delay to make this, demo run at a reasonable speed. And then in our event loops, we're going to capture the joystick events here. So the first event type that I'm going to show you is the SDL Joy Axis Motion. And again, this is going to be for SDL 2 right now where I'm showing you the code. And the important parts here. So once I know that I've had a motion event, meaning again that I have moved a joystick on a gamepad or an actual joystick, then we're going to say which axis. Okay, so it kind of reads, or actually, sorry, this is going to check which controller. Sorry, let me make sure I check for the controller. Check, which. And I'll say joystick since we're using the joystick API for this. Which joystick moved, right? Because we can have a bunch of these IDs. I just have 0 because I have one that's plugged in, and I'm going to assume is plugged in when we start this system. And that's what we got here, okay? And then what I'm going to say is I want to know, did I move in the X direction or was that event in the Y direction, okay? Now, again, remember from the event loop here that we have, right? Even if I move it diagonally, that will create a event for how far I moved, in the x-axis and how far I moved in the y-axis. Okay, so it might create those two separate events here. But regardless, we want to handle those, the x and the y-axis, right? Those are the two dimensions that we have on this controller. X-axis happens to be 0, y-axis happens to be 1, and that's the joystick axis. So I'm checking. And then basically what I'm doing in this code, and there's probably neater ways to write this, but a loop, a nested conditional statement will work just fine. Right? Maybe I would abstract this into functions just to clean up this loop in a real program. But then I'm just saying, hey, if my value, whatever I return, is greater than the dead zone, then I'm moving in the X direction positively. So I'll do something in my game code with that. Otherwise, if it's less than the dead zone value, it's -1. And if it's not either of those, just set the value to 0. Right? Some sort of default state, make our character stop moving in the X axis. That's the basic idea. And then I basically repeat that code for the Y axis as well. Okay, so again, if you're just starting off with this, right, try this with just the x-axis and see if you get a rectangle moving back and forth left and right, okay? That's the basic idea. So let's kind of pause there for a moment and kind of look at this from the documentation standpoint here, meaning like how do we figure this stuff out if I didn't know anything? Well, the most important thing probably to do is, you could click around in some of these functions. Sometimes there's examples. Let's see. But probably what I would want to do is just start again with the SDL event code. So let's look at event handling. And then the all important struct here for SDL event. Now you will notice there are the joystick events here. So actually we can go here too as well. If I have a joy button event here, because that might be my next question. Okay, you showed me how to handle a motion here, but what do I know about a button event here? Well, what's the event type going to be? And let's kind of navigate through this here. Let's actually look at the button code now. Oops, let's see here. Let's do this here, and there we go. And let me get you to the button code down here, right? The event type here. So we want to see if there's something else, with our button press, not just the joy axis motion here. Okay, so event.type equals SDL joy button down. How did I figure that out? Well, I looked at this here, the SDL underscore joy button event, and it's either one of these. The button's either gonna be down or up. Okay, pressed down, or sometimes you want to do stuff when a button is released, so you have up there. You can see again, like which joystick did the things here. I didn't bother with that code so much, but again, you'd want to, in a cooperative game, for instance, or if you have multiple joysticks, see which controller was pressed. And then of course you could get the state to see if you just pressed or if you released. And then probably what we care about is the button as well. Okay, so that's what we can actually do here. We could see our event dot, and now how did I figure out J button here? Okay, dot button here, because I know it's a joystick button thing. I mean, we could maybe kind of guess from this other code where I was doing J axis, joystick axis for something. But actually what I did was I hopped into the SDL events code here. And then what I do is SDL joystick, let's see, joy button event. And let's see here. Well, it looks like joystick button event structure event.jButton. Okay, so it actually tells you that dot, and then the asterisk indicates that then you can put in like the button ID here. Okay, so that's the basic idea. That's how I got to .jButton. So if you have other like device events here, let's see if we could find one. Battery event. Okay, here's one. So event.jBattery. Maybe you'll look at your controller, right? Which one, controller 0, and you can get the level and say, to the player if it's less than 10 or something. I don't know exactly the scale on this. Low battery, you can do some experiments here. Let's see, here's for the game controller. You can follow the same thing, right? It'll be event dot C axis. So that's what you've got there again for your game controller. So same thing. Let's look a little bit more here just for a moment, and then we'll run the actual demo again. Let's see, you got your joy ball here for the trackball portion of your stuff here. The J axis, here we go. So again, you have the axis, and then the axis value, and here's those exact numbers: negative 32,768, something I should have memorized, and 32,767. Okay, so your short value, 16 bits. Okay, so with that said, that's just a little bit about how to read the documentation. Let's go ahead and give this a run and see it in action. So I'll go ahead and compile this using our code here. And let's go ahead and bring in our window. And again, you'll see if I press a button, let's put this up to the camera so you can see here. Let's press this one, this one, this one, this one. And I think it might depend, oops, I moved some stuff. And if you even press the buttons in, like the controllers, it's detecting those, which is pretty neat. You could hit the triggers here. It's not detecting all the triggers here, so that might be something on the game controller API you might want to look at. But anyways, it's giving you enough there that you could probably get started with playing around with the API. It's also detecting like the option buttons. Here, I'll stop moving stuff around here, just so you can see that as well. So anyways, that should be enough to get you started with this API. I'll go ahead and do another, let's move it around here. Again, as I said, it's really fun to kind of move this around. And again, you'll notice that the actual moving around, I basically just handle the event that, there was some move in some direction. And then in my game code, I was just incrementing and decrementing the direction here. Okay. And then there's a bounds here because I don't want it to move off the window. So let's just go through scroll through the code one more time slowly in case you want to pause the video here. So from the start, some of our setup code. And then we, again, started our initialization and then started setting up the joysticks here. And then once we had our joystick set up, we talked about the dead zone. And then we got into our main game loop. And this time we're getting ready to handle more events. what types of events, things like the joystick moving, handling which controller was moving, the X and the Y axis. So that's all this code here. And then we figured out how, using the SDL documentation, to look at things like, was a button down pressed? And then you could look at the other, handling the other gamepad controls and so on from the help there. Okay, so hopefully that was useful. Hopefully that was fun for you to check out here. And again, as I mentioned, it's a fun little demo to play around with here. And I could probably play around with this thing all day because, again, I don't know. There's just something really neat about moving some physical device that's not always your keyboard and mouse and getting it to move. So whether you're going to use this for games or other applications, well, now you know how it works, and hopefully you'll enjoy that. Now, the last thing that I'll go ahead and talk to you about, which I'm excited about in sharing, let me go back to my screen here, is that I am working on building a course. It might be released by the time you see this on SDL game development. So feel free to check out that. This is the page that's going to be built out. It's on courses.msha.io. If you don't see it on the front page, you can go to all courses, but it'll be on the front page when it's officially released. But you can get a pre-release right now if it's not already released here, and that's going to be in SDL 3, so you'll see things all in the SDL 3 way. But of course, there'll be other resources, tutorials, and fun stuff as we've been doing here. So anyways, folks, with that said, hope you enjoyed that tutorial. Hopefully that answers some of your questions. I've had this controller sitting on my desk unopened for something like 6 months, and it was time to do something about it. So hopefully you enjoyed, hopefully you learned, and hopefully that'll inspire you to build some cool games or applications with some new devices. Anyways, folks, thanks for your time and attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next one.